Together with the College of Science for over 20 years now to make the Frontiers of Science one of the university's oldest and most popular lecture series. We regularly host presenters who are doing pioneering work in their fields, scholars who are making the discoveries that explain our world and affect our lives. If you were here for the last one, I expect you're eating less sugar this week. Tonight's speaker is no exception to this rule. I'd like to thank Dr. Donald Canfield, Professor of Ecology at the University of Southern Denmark, for agreeing to give our lecture tonight. He will speak about the history of oxygen on Earth and its connections to biological evolution. So the topic is truly cross-disciplinary. His lecture is titled, Breathing Easy at Night, The History of Atmospheric Oxygen. I've asked Dr. Turi Serling, sitting next to Dr. Canfield, to introduce Dr. Canfield and his work in a little more detail. Turi holds appointments in both geology and geophysics and in biology here at the University of Utah. His own research interests intersect with those of Dr. Canfield in a number of ways. I want to thank you all for attending. I hope you enjoyed the lecture. And if you have ideas for lectures, let us know about them, because we want to present what you want to hear about. All right? So please welcome Dr. Turi Serling, who will make the introduction. Thank you.
Hi, I've known Don for some number of years and really admired his pathway through the I guess it's all the dirty stuff, but sometimes that you feel between your toes. Don is very interested in the history of oxygen and especially how organisms can live at different levels of oxygen. And when you're wandering in the gooey lakes and things, that oxygen levels down there and that squishy stuff between your toes is really, really low. But that's what Earth's history was like for much of the time of the history of our planet. And I first became aware of Don's work when he was a grad student or publishing the work that he did as a grad student. And he was working in that really knotty area of oxidation reduction, which always gives us problems in chemistry. But he was really interested in the linkages between iron, sulfur, and the carbon cycles, and they're linked through oxygen, and it's really a tricky system. And he was not only interested in that today, but in the history of all of geological time. So he's put together some really interesting things to tell the story he'll be talking about today. He started as growing up in Ohio and went to Miami of Ohio and began as a chemistry major there and made the lucky discovery of I was a chemistry major as an undergraduate too, and I felt lucky to really realize that for me, the truly interesting thing was the chemistry of natural things. And Don, as an undergraduate, started working on a lake in Ohio. He was actually able to go to Antarctica to work at the Dry Valley Lakes in Antarctica. And then he went on to work with Bob Berner at Yale University on the various geochemical cycles. Did a postdoc with Dave Demery at NASA Ames on microbial mats and how they use elements in the geological cycle. And then for about the last, not sure, probably 20 years, he's been in Denmark and working on the history of oxygen in the atmosphere, which he'll lecture on tonight. He's been recognized with a variety of honors, including being elected to the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S., in Denmark, and also in Sweden. And today he'll tell us about the history of oxygen, and I think you'll find to be relieved that oxygen today in our atmosphere on Earth is not what it's been for most of Earth's history. So, Don?
Well, thanks for the warm introductions. Do we have any high school students here today? Yeah. Hi, guys. I'll promise to try to do my best to make it accessible for you. So bear with me. Okay, so we're all doing it now, and we do it about 20,000 times every day. We're breathing, right? And we don't give it a whole lot of thought unless we're maybe like this person here, this climber approaching the top of Mount Everest with a gas mask on. And that gas mask, of course, is connected to an oxygen bottle, and the reason that it is because there isn't a whole lot of oxygen way up on the top of Mount Everest. So actually, we do care about oxygen, and NASA cares about oxygen. I'll tell you a little story. When I was working at Dave Demaray's lab in NASA, there was this building 134, which was kind of across from our building, and I had occasion to go in there now and again to do some work, and it had these, you've probably seen these in films, right? These incredible human centrifuges and these big sort of vacuum containers where people would go in and they'd suck vacuum out or put pressure in. And I guess that's where they did some of these experiments, where they try to figure out just where the oxygen levels are safe for humans or not. And on the left-hand side is the partial pressure of oxygen. There's a line there that tells you what it is at sea level. And you can see that when oxygen is about 20% of what it is around us right now, well, we're not quite at sea level, but anyway, we can survive about a minute. I don't know how they did these experiments. But anyway, you can see that when you get up to long survival, humans can survive with oxygen levels of about 40% or so of what you have around you now, but not less than that. So oxygen does matter. The amount of oxygen matters. And the question is, as Tori raised, is, well, has it always been like that in Earth history? Have we always had this much oxygen around? Well, that's what I want to talk about today. And in order to do that, well, we need to talk a little bit about Earth history. Well, the Earth is pretty darn old. It's 4.5 billion years old, which is about a third of the age of the universe. So to think about it in cosmic terms. And, well, there's a whole bunch of eras and periods and stuff like that. I don't really want you to think about that, but what I want to do is to point out that right now, in just a second, we're going to go and we're going to look at some rocks that are about 2.5 billion years old. So that's a little bit more than halfway back in Earth history. And these rocks that we're going to look at are from Western Australia in the Hammersley Range there. And it's a really beautiful place where rivers have cut some amazing gorges into the landscape. And if you climb down into these gorges, you might find something like this type of rock here. And these are called banded iron formations. And the reason that they are is because, well, they're banded, right? And they're full of iron. And there's nothing like that depositing anywhere in the world today. I have to tell you, when I don't think about this. This is ocean bottom. We're looking at ancient ocean bottom. So when I'm talking about sediments, I forget sometimes that people might not connect that. But this is what the bottom of the ocean, the mud in the ocean that Tori was talking about just a minute ago, looked like, at least in part, at this time in Earth history. So banded iron formations, it's full of iron. The reason it's full of iron is because iron could transport easily around in the ocean at that time. It doesn't today, and the reason it doesn't today is because iron, in the form where it can be transported, oxidizes very rapidly with oxygen, forming, well, rust. So you can think about it like that. When you have oxygen around, iron forms rust. When you don't have oxygen around, iron can be transported freely in solution. So something was very different about the oceans at this time in Earth history, and probably the atmosphere. So why don't we just take a look at that? The question is, can we identify also whether or not there are differences in the atmosphere and the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere at this time? And to do that, we take a look at this. And probably most of you recognize this as a beautiful crystal of pyrite. So why should I show you a crystal of pyrite? Well, we don't have time to do this experiment here, but if you ever feel like it, take a crystal of pyrite and go put it out in your backyard. It might take a little while, but watch what happens. What should happen, if what I'm telling you is right, is that over time that pyrite is going to react with the rain and the oxygen in the atmosphere to form, well, rust, and it's going to corrode. And eventually over some months or maybe a year or so, it'll fall apart completely. So pyrite reacts with oxygen, and it corrodes and disappears as a result of doing that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you to another place in Earth history, a little bit older than the last one. This is 2.7 billion years old. And this is the Witwatersrand gold mines in South Africa. So it's probably a terrible place to work, but it's a really interesting place to visit. These are the biggest gold mines in the world, so the most gold that's mined comes from these places. And if you look at this is a piece of a rock from these mines, and well, if you're a geologist, you would recognize that what you're looking at is actually a piece of an ancient riverbed. So this is an ancient riverbed, and you can tell that because of the pebbles, which are rounded, so they've been tumbled downstream as currents have taken them. But what about all this gold stuff, right? Well, that actually isn't gold, it's pyrite. And those pyrites are rounded like the pebbles are. So at this time, at this place in Earth history, the pyrite was able to tumble around in the stream and be transported in the stream. And importantly, not being oxidized away. So this is pretty good evidence that at this point in Earth history, oxygen levels were much, much lower than they were today. Okay. Now, especially for the high school kids, okay, I'm going to talk about isotopes for a moment. I'm going to have to come back and talk about isotopes later, so I'm warning you. Now, isotopes actually aren't tricky, especially if you don't think about them too hard. So I'm not going to give you anything that you need to think about too hard. And if you want to look at this graph, what you really want to notice is there's something very different when you look on the right compared to the left, right? So anybody can see that. Now let's talk about isotopes. So what we're looking at is the behavior of sulfur isotopes. And sulfur isotopes in nature, natural abundance, come in four flavors. So there's sulfur 32, 33, 34, and 36. Now here comes a tough one. Sometimes, through various processes, biological maybe, these isotopes become fractionated from one another. So that means that the lighter isotope, let's say the sulfur 32, enters into a reaction at a rate a little bit different from the other isotopes. That's all fractionation means. Now, when the world works as we all expect it should work, then this isotope fractionation is very, very predictable. It's called mass dependent. It depends on the mass of the isotope. So I don't want to get into that. Let's just say it's predictable. Okay, we'll leave it at that. It's predictable. And when it's predictable, that means you get a flat line like we have here on the left. Okay? When it's not predictable, that means we get all the jumpy stuff that we have on the right. That's called mass independent isotope behavior. So this time in Earth history, before about 2.4 billion years ago, sulfur isotopes had mass independent behavior. Whoa, okay, what does that tell us about anything? Well, let's think about where sulfur comes from. The sulfur that we have on the surface of the earth, dissolved in the oceans, ultimately comes from volcanoes. Ultimately from volcanoes. And it comes out of volcanoes as SO2 gas. Okay, this SO2 gas comes out and comes into the atmosphere. And what can happen is that ultraviolet light can interact with the SO2 gas. And when it does that, it transforms the SO2 gas into other compounds. Okay, we don't need to get into details about that. But it does so in a mass-independent way. So we can get mass-independent fractionations. Okay, so that's what we're looking at on the right-hand side here probably is volcanic gases which are interacting with UV light. Big deal. Well, it doesn't happen today, and maybe some of you guys know this, especially the high school kids, that, well, it doesn't happen today because, well, the UV light doesn't really interact with the SO2. Why is that? Well, if you start thinking a little bit about the news and stuff, you start thinking, well, wait a minute, UV light, maybe there's something about ozone, right? You've heard about that. Where does ozone come from? Ozone comes from oxygen. So what we're looking at is a period of time from the sulfur isotopes where we have very, very little oxygen in the atmosphere, okay? So this is probably the best evidence that we have at all in geology about the levels of oxygen early in Earth history. But something changed, right? You can see that at about 2.4, 2.3 billion years ago, something changed. Well, let's zoom in on that time period just a little bit. So now we're looking at a much narrower window of time here, and well, this was a pretty fascinating time in Earth history. There was a bunch of glaciations then. Let's not get into that. But let's look at the right-hand side. You can see that we get this mass-independent stuff, right? Then there's a glaciation. Then we get mass-independent stuff. And then it stops. After that, it stops. We don't have that mass-independent stuff anymore. This time period here at about 2.35 billion years is called the Great Oxidation Event. The Great Oxidation Event. That's where the Earth's atmosphere went from a reducing stage, very little oxygen, to much, much higher levels. Okay, that's kind of cool. Well, how did that happen? If we want to understand about oxygen, we all kind of, where's oxygen come from, right? Well, we'll get back to this in a minute. Plants, right? It comes from plants. It comes from algae in the oceans and algae in lakes, right? But it didn't back then. Those are actually relatively recent, not relatively recent, but they're not the first organisms that produced oxygen. The very first organisms to produce oxygen were these guys, cyanobacteria, bacteria. So I'm really big fans of cyanobacteria, and in a way I think we all should be, because if these guys had never evolved, we would never be here. So we actually have a lot to thank these little guys for. And anyway, I kind of throw this in as a way of thinking about what it might have looked like. So cyanobacteria would have been, at that time, floating around in the upper layers of the oceans, just like algae do today, and cyanobacteria, actually, some of them. And they would have been found in stromatolites. Stromatolites build these amazing structures like we have here. These are actually modern ones. These are from Shark's Bay, Australia. So if you ever do go to the Hammersley Basin to look at those banded iron formations, just drive on over to the coast and you can see these stromatolites at Shark's Bay. They're absolutely beautiful. And if you kind of think about it and you kind of squint just a little bit and maybe daydream just a little bit more, and you look out over the ocean from the shore in Shark's Bay, you can sort of imagine that this is what the world looked like 2.5 billion years ago, which I think is kind of cool. Got to tune the birds and fish out too. But we'll get back to those guys in just a minute. Well, I kind of, in a way, I kind of hate to do what I'm going to do next, but I'm going to do it anyway, because the question is this: the Great Oxidation Event. You know that where we saw that transition from low oxygen to more oxygen. Why did that happen? What was the cause of that? Well, one possible explanation would be that was when cyanobacteria evolved, right? Then you get oxygen. Okay, that's the easy explanation, I think. But I don't think it's the right explanation. And the reason that I don't is because as geologists, we like to poke around a lot. And one of the places where we've been poking around are some pretty old rocks. So they're 3 billion years old. So these are older than any of the rocks we've looked at so far. And again, it's isotopes. But don't think about the isotopes. Just look at the graph on the right-hand side here. These are the isotopes of chrome. Right, go figure, right? Yeah, but they are. And if you look in the graph on the right-hand side, what you see, oh, actually, I should explain this in another way. What we're looking at is a paleosol. A paleosol. What's a paleosol? A paleosol means an ancient soil. So, what I want you to imagine is this. I want you to imagine Hawaii. That's a good place to imagine. So imagine Hawaii and imagine a fresh lava flow on Hawaii. That's probably not such a bad thing to imagine either. And now, what I want you to imagine is what happens to that lava flow as the weather interacts with it, right? You get rain, and you get maybe some, well, let's forget about the plants. You get rain, and over time, this starts to transform. It starts to weather, a process called weathering. And if you come back, if in 100 years, maybe 1,000 years, well, we won't be able to do that, right? But if somebody does, what you'll see is there's going to be some soil. What was once a solid mass of basalt is now weathered away into a layer of soil. That's a soil. And if you go, and if that soil gets preserved like 3 billion years in Earth history, then it's a paleosol. Okay, and that's what we have here. We have a basalt that's been weathered, not on Hawaii, but someplace else. And what you see is that the chrome is doing something really kind of crazy there, right? It should be, the chrome should be on that solid blue line. That's what chrome should be doing. That's what it was in the basalt. But actually, it's not doing that. It's going to negative values here. And it's going to negative values because it's been weathered in the presence of oxygen. That's a characteristic effect of that. It doesn't take a whole lot of oxygen to do this, so I haven't been telling you a whole lot of lies about oxygen being low. But what I think this is telling us is that at least sometimes in Earth history, we get little whiffs of oxygen into the atmosphere, little increases above what were probably extremely low values. And the reason I show you this is because if we can get whiffs of oxygen in the atmosphere 3 billion years ago, then cyanobacteria must have been around 3 billion years ago. And if cyanobacteria around were 3 billion years ago, then we've got a problem explaining this great oxidation by the evolution of cyanobacteria, right? That all kind of makes sense, I hope, that logic there. Crazy isotopes. So now we have to ask the question, well, actually, we probably should have done this in the beginning, but maybe this is the right time to do it. How do we get oxygen in the atmosphere anyway? Duh, right, Don? It's cyanobacteria and plants and algae, right? That's how we do it. Well, I want you to think about something. Let's try an experiment. You take a jar and you plant a seed, whatever, in that jar. Now you close it up. And what you do is you're going to watch a plant grow, right? So what do plants do? Plants take carbon dioxide and water from the environment, and they make plant material, and they make oxygen. Just like that, you can write it in a reaction. It's a really easy reaction. Just write it out, okay? So now, think about that. As this plant grows, okay, the plant is producing more oxygen, right? So the amount of oxygen that's produced by the plant is equal to the amount of plant that is grown. Now, think about what happens when the plant dies. It gets decomposed again, right? So that oxygen that was made in the first place then starts to react with the plant to decompose it again. It's a no-sum game, right? So you don't get oxygen in the atmosphere. But you do, because not all of that plant will decompose. A little bit of it will remain. That little bit of that plant that remains gets buried in soils or gets buried in sediments in the oceans, and that little bit of plant material that gets buried away in those sediments represents the oxygen that gets liberated into the atmosphere. Okay, so that's where the oxygen comes from, is the burial of that organic matter, that plant material, into sediments. Bury it away into geologic history. So that's what that arrow is, right? That's where the oxygen comes from. But what happens to the oxygen? Well, remember I talked about, well, let's look at that banded iron formation or some of the paleosols I've been talking about. That oxygen will react with rocks on the surface of the earth. So it's made by the burial of organic matter in sediments. Those sediments might get transported back up onto land by geologic processes at some point. The oxygen will react with it, bringing it back out. Okay, that's the area on the left. Well, remember I talked about volcanoes, SO2 gas coming out of volcanoes. Well, hydrogen gas comes out of volcanoes too, quite a lot of it. Oxygen reacts with hydrogen gas too. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that can react with hydrogen or can react with oxygen. And here I think is where the answer to our question lies. So, a little bit about Earth history, just a little tiny bit about that. So the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and way back when the Earth was first formed, it was a hotter planet, and part of the reason that it was hotter is because there was more radioactive stuff in the interior of the Earth. What that meant is that there was more volcanoes earlier in Earth history. There was more hydrogen coming out of volcanoes earlier in Earth history. And if you try to follow that kind of logic here, the hydrogen supply was high. The hydrogen supply was high, but the oxygen supply was low. Oxygen supply and hydrogen demand here are pretty much the same thing. So the hydrogen supply exceeded the oxygen production, and that meant that there was no way oxygen could accumulate, right? Because there was too much hydrogen in the atmosphere. But you come to a point at about 2 to 2.5 billion years ago where the oxygen demand or oxygen production exceeded the hydrogen supply. Then oxygen could accumulate. That's the GOE. At least that's an idea as to that's the GOE. Kind of complex, huh? But that's just the way it is. But I think it's kind of interesting to think about that too, that, well, the oxygen in the atmosphere, the oxygen that we have, the oxygen that we ultimately come to breathe is a result of a lot of different processes acting and interacting in the right kind of way. Okay, let's go a little further. I won't talk about that. So I've tried to reconstruct a history for oxygen, and some of it's a little bit guesswork, some of it's a little bit better than that. And that history looks a little bit like this. So if it's a dark area, I think, well, that's a most likely reconstruction. If it's gray, well, that's possible. On the side here, on the left-hand side, I have percent present-day oxygen levels. So if it's 100, that's 100% of present-day levels, right? So that's what we have today. And whoa, way back early in Earth history, the best idea is that we have like about 100,000 times less oxygen than today, maybe even less than that. That's not much. The Great Oxidation Event brought us up probably several orders of magnitude. Now I've got that little bump. You see that little bump right there at about 2 billion years? I don't want to talk a whole lot about it, but that represents the idea that there's dynamics in this system. That in fact, we have evidence that oxygen didn't just sort of flow around at these kind of constant levels and then go up. And there's dynamics. We just don't understand those dynamics well, so we don't put them in. But I put one in there because that's a dynamic I think we do understand. Okay, now we've got oxygen moving around at values that I think are probably between about 1 and 10% of present-day levels. And this is a real interesting level to be in. And the reason is because I want to talk about animals. And, okay, for those of you that might not be aware of it, animals evolved probably first around 700 to 800 million years ago, something like that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide or two. And there's an idea that at least big animals with a little bit of movement in them, their evolution might have been enabled by an increase in oxygen. So you see that here at around 500 million years ago, I've drawn in an increase in oxygen. And the idea is that maybe that increase in oxygen actually enabled, in a big part, animal evolution. Well, That's an idea that I've actually been involved with trying to propagate, and it's also an idea that in the next few slides you'll see I'm going to try to dismantle. And the idea, the question is, if oxygen enabled animal evolution, then the real question should be, how much oxygen do animals need? Well, we know we need a lot, but we're just one kind of an animal, and we're by no means the first kinds of animals that evolved on the Earth. In order to think about that, we need to look at a drawing a little bit more like this. So that oxygen plot I just showed you has been flipped around here, so that's old, that's new. And now you see these guys swimming around here on the bottom? These are called choanoflagellates. They're little tiny ciliates. And for a variety of reasons, we believe that these represent sort of the common ancestor to animals, or little ciliates like these choanoflagellates here. And sort of a way of thinking about how at least the earliest animals might have originated is to take a choanoflagellate and say, well, actually choanoflagellates, they occasionally form colonies together. So, okay, so you get a single-celled organism, and now you start to form colonies into a multicellular organism. We're multicellular, right? That's a good start. And then, at some point, they started to organize themselves into ways that actually started to create a function. So in this case, it's been drawn such that these choanoflagellates have organized themselves into some kind of a canal that might be used to transport water, for example. Well, this is starting to look a lot like some of the early animals, or at least some of the animals we believed are some of the earliest animals on Earth, and those are sponges, right? This is a sponge. So what we decided to do was to look at the oxygen requirements of sponges. Oddly enough, nobody had done that before, so it was really kind of a cool opportunity for us. And have any of you guys ever tried to keep sponges? I mean, why would you try to do that, right? I mean, live ones. And well, they're actually really, really hard to keep alive. They're really hard to work with. So my poor students spent 4 months trying to call this person and organize to get sponges from there and here, and nobody has them because nobody can keep them. I live in Denmark, and what's Denmark surrounded by? It's surrounded by water, right? So we drove 20 kilometers out to our university field station and went down and just grabbed some right off the dock like that. And then this is what we used, hypochondria. So anyway, we didn't really have to do all that. And we found out we could actually keep them alive for some months, so all that wasted time. But anyway, what we decided to do was a little experiment, and I'll show you a little bit about this experiment. So there's kind of a rather poor-looking hypochondria in a beaker here. And what happens is that I have an oxygen sensor, which is that B thing there, and this oxygen sensor tells us how much oxygen there is in the beaker. And what that oxygen sensor does is it has a controller, and the controller flips on a pump, and that pump takes oxygenated water from F through silicone tube, and then drops that silicone tube into the bottle like this, and then brings it back again. And silicone is a wonderful stuff because actually oxygen and gases diffuse very, very freely through the silicon. So this way, we could regulate the amount of oxygen that there was in these sponges. And we played a lot with this. We really did. We thought this was just so cool and so exciting that we really did a lot of work here. And what we did is we didn't want to hurt our sponges, you know. We felt that they were our friends. So what we wanted to do was to bring oxygen down really slowly and to see how they responded. And we kept bringing oxygen down. And we actually got down to about as low as our controller could maintain. And here we are. We're down to 2-3% of atmospheric oxygen levels. This is nothing, right? This is very, very small amounts of oxygen. And it's oxygen in that range that we thought existed way before animals evolved, too. That's one thing to keep in mind. So what we were able to do was to keep these sponges in an experiment where we could see that they were respiring, we could see that they were feeding, we could see that they looked nice and fine and were doing well. And we were content with our work that these sponges that we had could keep themselves alive in oxygen levels that vary between about 1 and 4% of present-day levels. That's not a whole lot of oxygen. We could never make it, right? Not even for 1 minute. But these sponges seems like they could make it for a long, long time at these low levels of oxygen. So our conclusion from this is that the earliest animals anyway, were probably not inhibited by the amount of oxygen that there was in the environment, and that the evolution of animal life at the time that it occurred was not due to an oxygen constraint. It was due to something else. We can talk about that later if you want to, but the subject here is oxygen. So our experiments, I think, were pretty cool in showing that these early animals, and sponges represent the earliest animals we know, don't need a whole lot of oxygen. We're going to keep working on this and just keep pushing this limit and see just how low levels they can tolerate. But this is what we have for now. So now, animals, right? Animals. So at about 550 million years ago, 540 to 50 million years ago, animals kind of exploded onto the scene. And I think one of the things that really has been interesting to me is well, what has been the oxygen environment that animals actually came to live in? And well, the earliest animals didn't need a whole lot, that's for sure. And well, how did oxygen levels actually continue to develop since those times when animals first started to evolve? And you know, the problem is that when you get into levels of oxygen that are relatively high, it's not easy to come up with tools to be able to figure out just how much oxygen there was. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could go back with some kind of a spaceship or some kind of an oxygen probe and just kind of wave it around in the air like 300 million years ago and say, yeah, I knew I was right. That was it. We can't really do that. So we rely on models mainly. And I don't want to get into the details or nitty-gritty or nuts and bolts of how these models work. That would bore us all to tears. But what I do want to show is that the models don't always say the same thing. We have two models here, two very good models here. And one of them says that back at about 550 million years ago, when animals first started to really populate the Earth in a big way, oxygen levels weren't that different from today. And another model says, yes, they were. Okay. So I think with this difference of opinion, it's probably not a bad idea to see if maybe there is some way we can try to rationalize this. Isotopes again. Oh God. Okay, this isn't hard. What we're looking at is an element called molybdenum, and we're looking at the isotopic composition of molybdenum. Just bear with me here. It's not that hard. So molybdenum comes into the oceans from rivers with an isotopic composition of 0.7. We say 0.7 per mil. Don't worry about the per mil. Just think about it as 0.7, okay? And it's removed, this is kind of the simple version of the story, but it's removed from the oceans in two ways with two different isotopic values associated with it. It can be removed in oxygenated environments with an isotopic value of minus 0.7, and it can be removed into anoxic environments like the Black Sea. Does everybody heard of the Black Sea? Yeah, okay. It can be removed into the Black Sea with an isotopic value very similar to what it is in seawater. Okay. So now, let's just say that there's no removal of oxygen through the oxic pathway, or molybdenum from the oxic pathway. It comes into rivers. It's not removed by the oxic pathway. That means there's no process to remove it with a fractionation. So if that was the case, if there was no oxic pathway, the rivers and the oceans would have the same isotopic composition, and we'd be able to read that in sediments from euxinic environments. Does that make sense? Make kind of sense? Yeah, good. So now what happens is we start to add some of that 0.7 on, that minus 0.7 on, right? The more of that minus 0.7 stuff that we have removing molybdenum, the heavier the oceans get, right? Because if you start out at 0.7 and you take a whole bunch at minus 0.7 away, then the rest has to have, just by mass balance, has to have an effect, right? In this case, it has to get bigger, it has to get heavier. So the more of the oxic removal pathway, the heavier the value in the oceans get, and the heavier the values that we can read in the sediments become, right? I mean, it sort of makes some sense without worrying about them being isotopes. So now we have a history of this molybdenum isotopic composition, and what you need to do is you need to kind of skate around the tops of the values. Don't worry too much about what's happening below, because we have all kinds of different types of sediments in here, and I don't want you to worry about that. But you see that when we're back before about 600 million years ago, the values are at about 1. That's not too far from 0.7, right? So that means that oxic removal part isn't that strong. But when we get up here to about the Cambrian well, I shouldn't start using terms like, when we get up here to about when animals evolved at about 550 million years, we get a jump, right? In fact, we get a really big jump for a little while, then it comes back down again. We get this really big jump, and then it comes back down to something which was greater than it was before. So there seemed to be a little bit more oxygen in the environment. And now, when we get to this time period here, about 400 million years ago, there's a big jump. I like that jump. That's a big jump. That means that, in my view anyway, that there's a whole lot more oxygen around in the oceans, in the environment, which tells me that this model here on the bottom is probably more correct. Because that's about the time when this model predicts that we should get an increase in oxygen. Whoa, okay. Well, that looks like kind of a consistent story there. Well, the question is, why in the world should oxygen increase at 400 million years ago? Well, there's actually a really good reason as to why oxygen should increase about that time period, and that has to do with the evolution of plants. Yeah, well, Don, there were organisms producing oxygen before plants. Why should plant evolution make any difference? Well, there's at least a couple of good reasons why plant evolution should make a difference. I'll tell you one of them. Okay, plants produce lignin and cellulose, and those compounds are pretty hard to decompose. So that represents even more organic matter that can be buried in the sediments, right? If you can't decompose it, then it gets preserved. So that means that the evolution of plants produces material that's more difficult to decompose, and because it's more difficult to decompose, we get more oxygen into the atmosphere. Okay? I think that's the one that I want to leave you with. We can talk about this back and forth. So plant evolution seems to be an important reason. And if we look around at a landscape back about this time, it looks something like that. Okay, it's not like going out and looking at a beautiful forest in the Rocky Mountains or something, but still, plants producing resistant organic matter. But you know, that's not the only thing that's sort of evolutionary interest at this time period, and this caught our attention right away. You know, fish evolved a long time ago. They evolved not so long after animals first started to evolve. But one thing that's happened with fish through time is that they've gotten a lot bigger. And in fact, the Devonian period, that time when plants evolved, that time when we think oxygen rose, that was a time when fish got really, really big. Ah, that's pretty cool, right? I think. Well, why is that cool? Okay, this is another graph, but it's not too hard to figure out. Bigger fish need more oxygen. I mean, that's sort of what this graph is telling you. So we have fish length on the left here. We have oxygen concentration on the right, and these dots represent oxygen levels where the fish just can't take it anymore. Okay, in a bunch of experiments. So that's sort of the level that they can't take it anymore. We have 15% present-day levels, 30% present-day levels. And what you see is that bigger fish generally need more oxygen. Smaller fish do better at lower levels of oxygen. So fish giganticism, big fish, big scary fish like these guys, which first came to be in about the Devonian period, might have been a response to an increase of oxygen. So that's kind of a cool thing, right? Plant evolution generates an increase of atmospheric oxygen, which cascades further into fish giganticism, right? So you have biological effects which cascade into geochemical effects, which cascade into other biological effects. I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so I want to finish up with one last thought. So people actually ask me this a lot. Well, what about now? What about the future? So what's happening now? What's happening now is that we all know this, that CO2 is accumulating into the atmosphere, right? And it's accumulating at rates which we can monitor really well. And, well, what happens when you burn gasoline in a coal plant, or you burn coal in a coal plant, or burn gasoline in your car? Well, you liberate CO2, but you also use oxygen in order to burn that, right? So the question then becomes, well, what about oxygen in the atmosphere? And in the last 10 years or so, methods have gotten good enough that we can actually measure the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere very accurately, and that's the graph here on the right. And you can see this kind of zigzaggy thing. The zigzag, why does it zigzag? This is a little bit of an aside. It zigzags because if you think about the northern hemisphere where we live, during the summer time, there's plenty of sunlight. There's plenty of sunlight. The plants are growing, right? There's leaves on the trees. They're producing oxygen. During the winter time, the leaves fall off the trees. There's not so much sunlight. The plants are respiring again. So you get this zigzag, this really nice zigzag thing. And you also see it in the CO2 for the same reason, except it's opposite. But there's no question that oxygen is also decreasing. So as fossil fuels are burned, oxygen levels are decreasing. And you can see from this graph that in the last almost 20 years, we've lost about 80 ppm of oxygen. Should we worry about that? Are you worried about that? I'm not worried about that because the background is 21,000 ppm. So there's really not enough fossil fuel, I don't think, in the world that you could burn to generate a substantial change in the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere. So at least that's a nice thought to take home with you. And with that, I'll say thanks for your attention.
Don is willing to answer questions, so have at it. Breathe easy.
Is the oxygen decreasing because of the increase in CO2, or is it because we're using the oxygen?
We're using the oxygen to burn the fuel, which generates the CO2. So it's a related process. Or a coupled process, yeah?
So you showed this transition where oxygen went up, then it became very stable.
Right.
So why didn't it just keep going up? What's kept it stable?
That's a really good question. So the amount of oxygen that we have in the atmosphere, this is a kinetic balance between the rate with which oxygen is produced and the rate with which it is being consumed. So the idea would be that in order to burn this organic matter that's produced by plants, we need just a little bit more oxygen in the atmosphere to kinetically burn it away. So if you think about it in a dynamic sense, you strike a balance between production and consumption, but the balance requires that you need more oxygen to be able to keep that balance alive. It's kinetics.
So if oxygen was produced primarily by plants throughout history, could the oxygen level be a proxy indicator of the total amount of fossil carbon that is ultimately available?
Oh, that's an interesting point. It depends on what you mean by fossil carbon. You know, when we think about fossil carbon, we think about coal and we think about gas and natural gas and stuff like that. That's only a small fraction of the amount of carbon that is actually buried away in sediments. So in marine sediments, for example, a typical amount of organic matter would be 1% or even less than that. It's a very small amount, but there's so much of this that it's not really a fossil fuel. So in a sense, the answer is no, because the fossil fuels are only a small amount of the total amount of organic carbon that's buried.
But do you know that fraction?
Yeah, in principle, sure. Yes?
So when you showed like the graph that you had where the oxygen increased dramatically in some places, I mean we're kind of a closed system, right? What is the oxygen being? If there wasn't oxygen in the atmosphere, what was being made into oxygen?
Oxygen is just coming from water, and yeah, I don't know quite what else to say. It is a closed system in a kinetic sense, right? Because the oxygen that gets produced actually ultimately gets utilized again, and the residence time, the average amount of time that oxygen spends in the atmosphere now is about 5 million years. So it's being cycled around pretty rapidly.
Is there any evidence that oxygen is like 30% or higher?
Yeah, that's on one of the graphs. So this is kind of an interesting question. There was a period in Earth history called the Carboniferous and Permian where there was a lot of burial of carbon in coal deposits, and that's a really great way to preserve a lot of carbon. And the models suggest that because this was such a great depositional event of organic matter, that oxygen levels actually did get quite a bit higher than today. And 30% is a value that people kind of throw around. Now, what happens is when oxygen gets much higher than 30%, then you run into a really interesting phenomenon where there's so much oxygen that wildfires would become rampant. So that kind of puts a cap on how high oxygen can actually become. Then you would burn away all the plants, and you wouldn't be able to sustain a good plant-rich biosphere. So yes, there is evidence that there's suggestions anyway that oxygen got higher, and the evidence that it did is in insect giganticism. So during this time period, you get these monster dragonflies, for example, with wingspans like this, and huge centipedes that are the size of a chair. And you know, the idea being that these organisms, with their type of high exercise metabolism and the way that they introduce oxygen in their bodies, needed more oxygen to be able to maintain their size. Yeah?
If organisms in the ocean were buried less because they were easier to decompose for some reason, because they were healthy, for example, would that drop oxygen faster and follow that plot?
If there was some mechanism by which you could change the decomposability of marine organic matter, yes, that would have an effect. I don't quite know what that mechanism would be, but yes, it would.
On your time scale, those things happened 2.5 billion years ago. Do you have a feel for when there was abundance of liquid water and when there wasn't in the Earth's history?
That's a good question. So the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and the earliest rocks that we have are about 3.8. And the reason that we're missing much of that historical record is because of the plate tectonics that we have, just the destruction. It's actually the only reason that we're alive, too, is because we have this constant destruction and weathering and stuff. But it also wreaks havoc on the geologic record. But what you can do is you can go to some old terrains and you can identify minerals called zircons, which are older than that. And there's a famous place in Australia called Jack Hills where they've identified zircons that go back to 4.3 or maybe even 4.4 billion years old. Now, when they look at the isotopic composition of the zircons, they're consistent with their formation in a liquid water environment. So the idea is that there was at least some kind of a liquid water ocean back before we actually have a rock record. So back before 4 billion years. Now, these rocks that I was telling you about at 3.8, those rocks, many of them were clearly deposited in a marine environment, and some actually in rather deep water. So water's been around for a long time on the Earth's surface. Probably virtually all of Earth's history. Not quite, but almost all of it.
Can you give us your personal opinion, changing the subject back to CO2 for a sec, the current worry, anthropogenic carbon levels versus when the sea level rose and they closed the Siberian land bridge before people were driving cars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can you give us a little thought about that in your mind?
I'd rather not. I mean, should we worry about CO2? Is that the question? Or what?
I don't worry about it, but somebody else may. I'm more worried about it.
Yeah.
Sold this TV station to the.
We can take that debate sort of privately or something. I think. Okay.
Do you know how much the rainforest, or areas of the most dense plant life, how much they contribute to the oxygen? And if we take out the rainforest, is that going to have a real effect, or are there other sources that?
Well, that's an interesting question. So terrestrial plant life is really interesting because it generates a lot of resistant carbon, and some of that resistant carbon makes its way into the oceans. I have to think about that one. That's a really good question. I have two answers, yes and no, and I can and my mind is racing with ways of trying to justify both of those. So I'll just leave that as that's a really interesting question. I'll give it some thought.
Before the Great Oxygenation event, do you have any idea what the atmospheric composition was? Like, was it mostly nitrogen? And if so, what percent?
The atmospheric composition has probably mostly been nitrogen through pretty much all of Earth history. There's a great debate as to how important CO2 was in the atmosphere at that time, and that's a whole nother interesting discussion about the idea that the sun was less luminous, and in order to have water persist on the planet with a less luminous sun, then you need more greenhouse gases. So there's a lot of discussion about what the level of CO2. Some actually have CO2 levels being quite high as oxygen is now in some models. That's pretty high. But nitrogen would have probably been the primary gas through it all. Yeah?
You say the oxygen all came out of water. What happened to all the hydrogen? Did it go into plants, or did it?
Yeah, exactly. So if you look at the chemistry of it, the hydrogen makes up sort of part of the organic molecules within plants.
If the CO2 is used by the plants and they give off oxygen and the animals use the oxygen, that would seem to be sort of imbalanced. But the percentage of the CO2 in the atmosphere is so much less than the percentage of the oxygen. So the plants are using that little CO2?
No, the plants are the basis for the whole food chain. So pretty much all of the carbon that ends up in animal life and all other life on the earth actually ultimately is derived from the plants themselves. So the organisms, an animal will eat some plant material, for example. Part of that plant material will be converted into body mass. Some of it will be respired by the organism, and that's just, if it's converted into biomass, then it's sort of just like imagining just taking plant and putting it into biomass. And if it's respiring the plant material, then you can just imagine like respiring the plant material. So it's just sort of a transfer of carbon and energy from one trophic state to another. But the basis, 99% of the carbon that's produced on the planet is produced ultimately from photosynthesis from plants.
Yeah, join me in thanking Don, and he'll be around.